Welcome back to the podcast. Now, as you know, the last podcast was my 100th podcast, and I put in a plug for one of my favorite son-in-laws, Phil Dugas of Dugas Creative. And if you want to use his services to develop a social media presence, to redesign your website, to build a community, he's ideal for any kind of small business and really ministry, then go to dugascreative.com. That's D-U-G-A-S, dugascreative.com. You will not be disappointed. It's made all the difference. It's revolutionized our ministry, actually, the Blonde and I. So, dugascreative.com. So this is podcast number 101. I'm not going to make a big deal out of every podcast, but anyway. Now, if you're listening to my recent podcast, this series, you know I'm focusing on spiritual intimacy in marriage. When you learn how to be spiritually intimate, you'll have the best closeness possible in marriage. And that's my topic today, how to get the best closeness possible in marriage. Now, before I cover today's topic, I want you to do two things. First, go to my website, davideclarkephd.com. That's Clarke with an E. All right, and once you're there, second, go to the books page and order my brand new couples devotional, The Secret to Becoming Soulmates. If you're interested in this spiritual bond as a couple, and I hope you are, boy, this book is the ticket. That's why I wrote it. This book, the Soulmates book, which you'll do together, it's meant to be done together, each reading, of course, each brief reading you do together, will get you to spiritual intimacy. If you're engaged, perfect for you. You want to know if you can spiritually bond prior to marriage, this will help you do that. You'll be so far ahead of the game. If your fiance is not willing to do the book, end the relationship. If your fiance who starts it, but no, I'm not interested in spiritual things, don't marry him. Don't marry her. But if they're willing to join you in this process, it's the best possible preparation for marriage, I think. If you're married to a non-Christian, this book is perfect for you. It's a gentle path, step, illuminating the blocks to knowing Christ and leading your spouse to Jesus. If you're married to a Christian, but he's not really on fire, he's not growing spiritually, once again, perfect. That's why I wrote it. Gentle, step by step, drawing him into a closer relationship or her closer relationship with Jesus, and then, of course, the spiritual bond. If you'd say, Dave, my marriage is okay, we're fine, nobody's talking about divorce, we're good, is that the kind of marriage you want? God's design is for it to be great. You put him at the center, it's going to be great. The Soulmates book is for you too. And if you're in a marital crisis right now, or know someone who is, that's also what I do. That's one of my specialties. You'll see all my resources for saving a marriage on my website, davideclarkephd.com, Clarke with an E. You name it, it's going to be there. Whatever your marital crisis, I've got a plan for it. I've got a book for you, a focus on that family video potentially for you, YouTube video, phone advice service, clips of me speaking, the lame excuses to end a marriage. It's all there on the website. And by the way, becoming spiritually intimate also fits into the marital crisis genre because it's a key to avoiding marital crisis. If you're already in a crisis, one of my other books will help you get out of the crisis. That's what they're for. And once you two are past the crisis and kind of moving past it, spiritual intimacy will be a key part of your new and improved marriage. No doubt about it, which will prevent any further crises. Now, before today's topic, let me answer a question from a podcast listener. It's a very timely question, which dovetails nicely with my topic today. Here's the question. My husband and I still love each other. No one is talking divorce, and we're not in a crisis. Okay, good. But, here's the but we both admit that we are pulling apart emotionally. This lady's acknowledging we're pulling apart. And our physical intimacy isn't what it used to be. See, it's already fading. It's already going the opposite direction, which happens to everybody without God. How can we get back on track and get close again? I've heard that question 1,000,000 times in 34 years. Here's the answer. You're not in a crisis now, but if you keep going the way you're going, you will be soon. We saw that in the previous podcast. You're going to end up, we just kept drifting apart, and then eventually somebody wants a divorce. Somebody wants out. So what's happening to you two is what happens to all couples without spiritual intimacy. It happened to me and the blonde, my wife Sandy. So I speak from experience. Having 4 little kids running around didn't help, but we hit the wall. That's been years ago now. The only way to reverse the deterioration and prevent the crisis is to put God at the center of your relationship. The world's answer is get divorced, who cares? It's like a refrigerator doesn't work anymore. A microwave, trash it, get a new one. No, that makes things worse. God says, hang in there, put me at the center. When you put God at the center of your relationship, you spiritually bond by doing this, everything will change. That'll give you the best intimacy possible and energize your emotional and physical intimacy. Listen to this, forever, for as long as you live. That's God's plan. God's principles last for eternity. And in terms of marriage, humanly speaking, until one of you dies, all the way through. I'm talking to this podcast listener and also to the rest of you, but listen, I want you to listen to this podcast right here today. Really, this series of podcasts on spiritual intimacy, and get my book, The Secret to Becoming Soulmates. I wrote it for every couple because every couple needs the spiritual bonding. You go through this together, you'll be amazed at what will happen. God will make it happen. With God at the center, through spiritual bonding, He'll pull the two of you closer and closer to Him and closer to each other. It's a win-win. So, whether you are in pre-crisis, there's no crisis now. If you're in a crisis or you're post-crisis in your marriage, this Soulmates devotional book is for you because you're going to have God's power to get through the crisis anyway. Typically, one of my other books, if you're in a huge crisis now, you won't start spiritually bonding because your spouse probably doesn't care. You get through the crisis, attract the person back, hopefully, but then as part of the recovery, spiritual bonding will be important. Okay, let me tell you how you can get the best closeness possible in your marriage. I don't tell you about some great secret and then that tell you what it is. I had always wanted to ride one of the famous San Francisco cable cars. It seemed like such an exciting and romantic thing to do. I don't want to live in San Francisco, frankly, but I wanted to ride a cable car and visit. Humphrey Bogart, my favorite movie actor, rode a cable car in the classic movie Dark Passage. His wife, Lauren Bacall, was in that movie with him. Humphrey looked incredibly cool on this ride, a little tense but cool. The wind whipped his thinning hair. He had steely eyes and a little smirk that said, I'm Humphrey Bogart, and you're not. Of course, Bogey would have looked cool waiting in line at the post office. I could just picture my one true love, Sandy, and me swinging up onto a cable car. I'd give her my best Bogey smirk, and she'd say in a low, throaty voice, Dave, you remind me of Humphrey Bogart. Just taller, better looking, and with more hair. It's my fantasy. I'd reply, yeah, baby, I know. Here's looking at you, kid. Which is what Bogey always said. And together we'd rumble up and down the beautiful hills of San Francisco on that cable car. Can you picture it? Okay, it was a crazy fantasy, but it was my fantasy, and I liked it. A few years ago, my cable car dream finally came true. A friend of mine, Mark Calcagno, who pastors a church outside Oakland, flew Sandy and me there so I could conduct a weekend seminar for his church. I was looking forward to speaking at the church, but I must admit that my first thought was, I'm going to ride a cable car, and Mark Calcagno is going to pay for it. Anyway, it worked out beautifully. And it's exactly what we did. On Saturday afternoon, following 2 talks on parenting, I told Mark about my plan. He said, look, there's a rental car I can get you. Actually, it was one of his parishioners, one of his church members, and we've gotten into this convertible car, and drove over the bridge into San Francisco. We drive into San Francisco on the Saturday. We grabbed a loaf of sourdough bread at Fisherman's Wharf, awesome, and made a beeline for the cable car depot. After waiting in line for an hour and a half, Bogey, that's me, and his babe boarded the cable car. I guess Sandy was Lauren Bacall, whatever. Since it was crowded, there were no places to stand outside near the railing, on the cable car. So we found places inside the car and held onto the overhead straps. And that was okay. We didn't mind since it was chilly outside. And at least we were on board. We were a little cramped and had trouble seeing outside, but it was safe and warm and okay. Okay, however, wasn't part of my cable car fantasy. Then it happened, just like in a movie. 2 people who had been perched on the railing of the cable car stepped off. And Sandy said to me, she's quick, Sandy. She said, let's get those spots and see what it's like riding out there. I married a genius. We raced over and stood side by side, hanging onto 2 poles at the edge of the car. We spent the next hour writing on the outside, and it was incredible. Oh, what a difference. We couldn't believe the difference between writing inside and outside. Standing by the railing with the brisk wind swirling around us, Sandy and I felt the pulse of the city. We felt alive and invigorated. We saw everything clearly. We heard all the sounds. We smelled all the scents. We went through Chinatown at one point, and they have all the chickens and the turkeys and I don't know what all hanging outside. I won't go into detail, but it was pretty exciting. We called to people walking on the sidewalks and riding in their cars. We whizzed by pedestrians, cars, shops, and restaurants with our feet just inches from the sidewalks. I mean, you're right there on the cable car. We laughed, we kissed, we had a blast. It was fun. And it was intimate. That experience was an ideal metaphor for the difference between having an average, ordinary marriage, which maybe you have now, and having a marriage based on spiritual intimacy. An average marriage is like riding inside the cable car. It's safe and warm. It may be okay, but it's also boring. You have no idea what you're missing. When you spiritually bond, you move to the outside of the cable car. It's exhilarating. It's adventuresome. It's a rush. It's passionate. It's the ride of your lives. So I'm asking you, and it's kind of a dumb question, but here it is. Do you want the best kind of intimacy in your marriage? Well, of course you do. Well, Dr. Clarke's here to give it to you. Actually, God is, but hopefully through me. Spiritual bonding creates genuine intimacy, the best and deepest kind. Coming together as a couple spiritually produces passion and energy unmatched in all of human experience. Nothing else can come close to matching it. Here's a little experiment. We psychologists love experiments, so humor me. I want you to recall the most intense and passionate physical time you've ever had with your spouse. Go ahead, picture it in your mind. And if you're listening to this together or watching it, you can talk about it if you want to. Perhaps you were intoxicated by the sheer excitement and electricity of your lovemaking. Two bodies became one. Maybe it was during your honeymoon. Maybe it was 10 years ago. Maybe it was last week. I don't know. Whatever magnificent physical interaction you're picturing pales in comparison to spiritual bonding. It's not even close. Sexual intercourse in marriage provides a great deal of pleasure and enjoyment. It's supposed to. That's God's design. But even at its best, listen to me, even at its best, it can never reach the fulfillment and satisfaction brought by spiritual bonding. No, not even close. Poor second. Now I want you to picture the most vulnerable, open, and meaningful emotional time you've ever had with a member of the opposite sex. All the defenses were down. Nothing was in the way. You were talking on the deepest level possible. You were totally in tune with each other. You had never felt closer. Time stood still as your hearts entwined in love. Hey, this is good writing. Well, you get the idea. Really, really deep personal connection emotionally. For me, I'll tell you what one of mine was. For me, one of these deep emotional connections happened in 1981 in San Diego at a Bob's Big Boy restaurant. Ever been to a Bob's Big Boy restaurant? Just a burger place. Since Bob's is a burger chain, I'm not sure if they're even still around, but they were back in that day. It may sound like a strange place for a romantic interlude, but Sandy and I had just gotten together after being broken up for a year, and we got back together at Bob's. I took her to Bob's. I'm a classy guy. I will never forget our 5-hour conversation at Bob's. The waitress wanted us to leave. We weren't going anywhere. We laughed and cried and poured out our hearts to each other. We talked about our previous year and the growth we had both experienced. We held hands, looked into each other's eyes, and agreed that our love would never die. Oh, it was awesome. The woman had finally come to her senses and realized that she was about to lose a major catch. Or was it me dropping to my knees, begging her to come back? I can't remember that part too well. It was a life-changing conversation that led to our engagement and eventual marriage. Still, my experience at Bob's, as great as that was, and whatever emotional high you're picturing now in your marriage, your relationship, pale in comparison to spiritual bonding. I'm telling you, that's how good it is. You're going to have to trust me and get the secret to Becoming Soulmates book to figure it out, to really experience it and know that I'm right. I'm telling you, it's terrific. There's no comparison. No matter how powerful it may be, no emotional high is even in the same league with a spiritual high. Now, another story. Have you ever seen a group of World War II veterans get together for a reunion? Man, it's something to see. The instant recognition, the camaraderie, the hugs, the tears, the stories of battles fought side by side all send one message to the observer. These men love each other and are bonded forever because they shared the experience of war. There is nothing like being in war together. Fighting the enemy together forges a unique closeness that cannot be broken by time, geographical distance, or any other force. These guys get together, and ladies too, for decades, and they never lose the bond. Even though I've never been close to a world war, there was a time in my life when I faced intense, brutal pressure. It was the early 1980s, and I was a student at Dallas Theological Seminary, toughest school I ever went to. My graduate school in psychology, also very tough, Western Seminary, not as tough as Dallas. As a college graduate, I figured I wouldn't have a problem handling the academic requirements of the seminary. I was wrong. Terribly wrong. I had never known such pressure, such a crushing workload, such demanding professors, and such incredibly unreasonable deadlines. They put us through the ringer. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Dallas Seminary, and I believe it is one of the finest theological institutions in the world, and I still believe that. But from day one, I felt as though I was fighting to keep my head above water. It was sink or swim at Dallas Seminary. The name of the game for me and for my fellow soldiers in Stearns Hall on campus, second floor, was survival. If you didn't find at least one guy to buddy up with, you sank without a trace. And we had several guys that left the seminary that couldn't take the pressure. And those guys didn't have friends. My best war buddy at Dallas was Tom Provenzzola. In that first year, we lived just a few doors apart on the dorm floor, Stearns Hall. Together, Tom and I faced the never-ending assaults of our seminary professors, the avalanche of papers due every week, the thousands and thousands of pages of reading. I almost went blind reading. And the tests, those impossibly long, diabolically complicated tests. I will never forget, and believe me, I've tried, one particular class with one particular professor. 3 times a week, at the crack of dawn, Tom and I had to drag out of bed so we could get to this class by 7 a.m. Who has a seminary class at 7 a.m.? It's cruel. Then we spent an hour and 10 minutes feverishly taking notes from a man who spoke in the world's most boring monotone. Tom and I had to slap each other every 10 minutes to keep from nodding off in that class. I often wondered if the Apostle Paul would have stayed awake in that class. I mean, this professor was brilliant, but boring. But the tests were the worst part of that class. We'd study our brains out for 3 or 4 days getting ready. Then at 7 a.m. on D-Day, we'd file into class and be handed a test that would take any normal person 3 hours to complete. The only problem was we had only an hour and 10 minutes to complete it, the class time. Tom and I would dig in and scribble our answers as fast as we possibly could. When the bell rang, we were totally and utterly drained. Our writing hands were frozen into claws. Our backs were sore. Our minds were mush. The final insult came when our professor handed back the graded tests. Every single time he told us, with a little smirk on his face, that his grader had trouble reading our writing. Really? He would ask us, and I actually think he was serious, to please write more legibly next time. Tom and I wanted to scream out loud, "Of course our tests have messy handwriting. Duh! You forced us to complete a 3-hour test in an hour and 10 minutes. But we said nothing to our professor. This was Dallas Seminary, and you don't do that there. We could only scream later when we were back in Stearns Hall. Here's the point. In the pressure-packed, grueling crucible of Dallas Seminary, Tom and I forged a close friendship. It was us against the seminary, and we pulled each other through. We have never forgotten those days, and we remain the best of friends today. He married a wonderful lady, Lola, just a doll, and they live in Virginia, wonderful people. Maybe you haven't been in a war or a grueling academic program, but I'll bet you work with someone toward a common goal. Sports team, volunteer activity, church committee, class project, PTA at your child's school, a charity. If you have, then you know that working together brings you closer to that person every time. Working together toward the greatest goal in life, knowing and loving God, creates the greatest closeness possible. Sandy and I have discovered this wonderful reality in our marriage. You and your partner can too. Listen to me, and this is the truth. When you connect spiritually in the presence of God, the walls between you and your partner come down. The walls that are always there between a man and a woman come down. God brings them down. And when God brings walls down, tears them down, they're down. You are two people, two souls coming together to know God better, to worship him, to love him with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. That's from Matthew 22, verse 37. You'll still be a man and a woman with differences and unique viewpoints. That doesn't change, and it shouldn't change. That's God's design. But you become male and female in the way God designed you to be. When you spiritually bond, your lives together become an adventure. It's an exhilarating ride, one characterized by unmatched closeness and intimacy. I recommend highly that you start the adventure by getting my book, The Secret to Becoming Soulmates. Now, you may be a husband that says, boy, I'm not sure if my wife will do this. She's not a Christian. She's not growing spiritually. Get the book. Ask her to do it. These are simple bite-sized chunks. Most decent people, unless you married a dirtball, will do the book with you. And along the way, if it's a non-Christian spouse, they'll come to Jesus, very likely. And if they already know Jesus but aren't growing spiritually, they can grow spiritually and you can begin the spiritual bond. It's the adventure of a lifetime. Sandy and I are still living it. You can too. So, finally, and importantly, if you're liking these podcasts, if they're benefiting you and others that you know, and I hope that's true, please give us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. And of course, share the podcast with others. This will help us continue to grow our audience and make a difference. We are saving and improving marriages, helping marriages in crisis. And this whole series on spiritual intimacy is vitally important. And if you're watching this podcast on YouTube, and many of you are choosing to do that now, which is great, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel and like this video. That will also help us to grow our audience. Very good. So next time I'll continue talking about the benefits of spiritual bonding, and I'm hoping to get the blonde to join me for one of the next few podcasts, and we'll do one of these devotional days together. It'll be like a window into our relationship. I'm trying to convince her. Pray about that, will you? She's not the upfront person. I'm not the shy, retiring type. She's a little more in the background. But hey, be great if she'll do that for us. So until next time, David E. Clarke, PhD.